Greetings and salutations, Internet. My name is Kind Death, and today we're starting a new series called The Flight Path. Now, this is going to be basically kind of a weekly rant-type video and more of a podcast-type format, something you can kind of listen to while you're playing the game over the weekend. And I think the big news this week was Lore's response to a forum post entitled Azerite, Worst Itemization in WoW's History. If you're someone that keeps up with podcasts, YouTube videos, kind of the general goings-on in the community for World of Warcraft, you probably have an idea about this post. I mean, there's generally a lot of opinions kind of flying around about this. Let me be completely transparent and honest. I used to be a very hardcore player back in classic World of Warcraft. Today, most of my guild, which were EverQuest players, probably would have a difficult time making it through Heroic. The game's much more difficult now than it was back then. There are some certain truths in the mentality and dedication that those players had. They might not have had the skill level to compete in Mythic raiding today, but they had the dedication. The thing with Mythic raiding is you have to have the skill and the dedication today. You can't just have one or the other to be successful, and that's kind of the difference between modern WoW and classic WoW. Today, I am much more of a casual player than I used to be. I think Preach and Bellular Gaming are great content creators, don't get me wrong. However, when I listen to their opinions given the game, most of the time, I adamantly disagree with them on most topics. I tend to agree with Asmongold on most of his points of view. However, I'm not a big fan of the way he presents it. I think I'd be closer to Hazel Nutty Games and Taliesin and Evitel. And I think that their objectivity towards the game and the developers sometimes sounds to players who are upset like they are taking the side of Blizzard, which just isn't the case. I really don't think there's any sense in taking the piss out of someone. It just doesn't leave any room for constructive criticism. And people like Blizzard and the developers are just going to tune you out if you're bitching at them. But let's be honest, most people that say the things that they say are just venting because they're frustrated, and I think Blizzard can sometimes get baited into that as well. I mean, if your ultimate goal is to make the game better, or there's a system that you really don't like, or you think it could really be improved, I think it's far more effective to say, I don't like these systems for these reasons, and I think it's bad for the game for these reasons, and here's my evidence for that, rather than saying, this system's stupid, the developers don't know what they're doing, they don't play their own game, they're detached from their player base. Now, whether this is true or false, what does that actually change about the game? What impact is that going to make? I would argue that would cause the developers who are listening to you and your large platform you might have on YouTube or Twitch to just tune you out. On the other hand, I understand why Twitch and YouTube personalities tend to be very bombastic in the way that they approach things because it generates views, especially on YouTube, where negativity and criticism and kind of preying on the emotions of an upset or excited player base really generates views and growth for them. So it's kind of this Ouroboros that is self-feeding and self-sustaining in a way, which the cyclical hatred and toxicity just keeps getting replicated and compounded, and maybe the better term for that would be to say that it's becoming concentrated, more potent. And that's not to say that Preach or Bellular aren't saying things that are true, because I think in this case, I adamantly do agree with them on these points. I actually thought Preach was a little bit more reserved than I thought he would be, because I have some pretty strong criticisms myself, but I think it's really important to point them out in a very constructive way, which I think in this case Preach did, and I think Bellular did not. I think Bellular's emotions kind of got the best of him, and I think that comes from a place of him genuinely wanting to see the game get better, but the problem is like I said, when you do that, you're actually hurting your cause, not helping your cause. So that's kind of the part where I blame the player base and the community in this sense of giving Blizzard the excuse of ignoring the community's feedback. It's these sort of over-exaggerated responses that you see in the alpha and beta forums. There are genuine complaints that just kind of go ignored because of the way that they're said. Just like so many things in life, it's not what you say, but how you say it. Now, where I would be critical of Blizzard here is they can't just lump the entire player base into these kind of zealous responses. Some of us are genuinely being constructive and genuinely giving good feedback, and it's genuinely getting ignored too. So it can't be either extreme of the spectrum, and both parties are partially to blame. Although I will say Blizzard are kind of the parents in this sense, and because they are the parents, the responsibility ultimately does fall at their feet. Now, I'd kind of like to dive into the substance of what lore said here. I kind of already presume that you've probably watched Preach, Bellular, Asmongold, Taliesin, and Evitel. However, I think there's some perspective that I can give that some of these other content creators cannot give, being that I know lore probably better than some of these people. While I'm not a friend of his, I used to be an acquaintance. I mean, long story short is I kind of know the guy. I met him all the way back at, the launch of Cataclysm at Best Buy in the south part of Grand Rapids, off of Beltline Road. This is back in the days when he was kind of doing tank spot videos. And some of the things that lore says that comes across in text format is very condescending, but that's just kind of lore's personality. I don't think he really means anything by that. He's not trying to be incendiary or whatever. That's just not kind of who the guy is. This is just his personality in general. He's kind of a take me or leave me kind of person. I genuinely don't believe he's saying this kind of stuff to be malicious. That doesn't make it okay for him to be this way, though. And to be honest, when he was hired by Blizzard and he stopped doing tank spot videos and kind of moved away from doing that, I was a bit surprised, because when you meet him in person, what you get on the internet's kind of what you get in person. I mean, he's an authentic guy. You can't criticize him for that. And I think that's probably one of the most important qualities anybody can have, is to be kind of forthcoming with that. I disagree with a lot of his stances and the way he views things. I mean, he's welcome to those, of course, just like anybody is. But I would say there's certain people that just don't work well in the service industry. They have a hard time when they get upset by people. I guess what I would say is, when you're a community manager, there's certain things that are expected of you in that position. And communication, being concise, being clear, and being patient, even in the heat of battle, which the forums are just an open battlefield all the time, that's just part of the whole shtick, man. That's like, you gotta accept the bad with the good, and there's a heck of a lot more bad than good, but that kind of comes along with the territory. And I think what you might be seeing is kind of the burnout of lore in the community manager role. And as somebody who used to watch his streams, even now I do sometimes, because he's a great, if you haven't seen any of his streams on Devil Lore on Twitch TV, which is where he streams, which is another one point I might get to a little bit later. He streams a lot of Grand Theft Auto 5 roleplay, which he does a great job. He plays a cop named Legs McCready. There's a couple other, I actually kind of like his old man that he roleplays as, that's confused, that like has wandered out of a nursing home. That's particularly hilarious. He's really good at it. Never would take that away from him. But during some of those streams when he has downtime, he'll pop his camera on, he'll talk to the community, and he'll just kind of have a discussion with people. And people brought up the whole idea of like, why don't you become a full-time Twitch streamer? You know, are you going to continue working at Blizzard? And he's been very open with people that have seen his stream, and I think a lot of people in the World of Warcraft community haven't seen that part of him, because they're probably not going to watch Grand Theft Auto 5 roleplay. If he was streaming World of Warcraft content, that'd probably be a different thing. But he's pretty openly said on there that he wants to move to being a full-time Twitch streamer and be partnered and just do that as his job. If he could get the kind of support and money follows there, he'd probably move away from his job at Blizzard. And I think part of that is the community manager burnout, but I also think that to a large degree he's lost a lot of passion for World of Warcraft. How much do you see him stream World of Warcraft on Twitch? If we're just looking at the metrics, almost every day the guy streams that he's out of work. You can go look at his Twitch channel and see the VODs on there. And it's Grand Theft Auto 5, Grand Theft Auto 5, Grand Theft Auto 5 for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours after work every night. So, if he's not at work, working at Blizzard, working on World of Warcraft content there and communicating with the developers, he's going home and playing Grand Theft Auto. Obviously, there's a detachment there from him in a personal standpoint. He just doesn't have the passion for WoW anymore, which is completely fine. And that's understandable. I think all of us have burnt out of WoW at some point or another, or we've moved on. There's a lot of people that I'm still friends with that don't play World of Warcraft anymore. They're great people. Doesn't make them bad. However, I think if you're a community manager, it becomes really hard to do your job well if you can't articulate what the community is feeling and seeing when they're playing the game. So if he's not into World of Warcraft anymore, that makes it really hard to understand the community's complaints and vocalize that in a clear way that makes sense to the developers. So he kind of becomes the middleman that's supposed to be the translator, and he's kind of speaking a language that, well, he can't speak the language, I guess would be the point. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is I think that this disconnect, and when you kind of you break down some of the analysis of the things that lore says, I don't think that this is necessarily representative as Blizzard as a company. I think it's more representative of lore as a person and kind of where he's at with his personal life right now. And I think his Twitter is pretty representative of that. Obviously, he can't do that on his work forums, but as we all know, social media today is you can't just go out there and say anything when somebody knows you're connected with an organization, because that reflects onto you and onto the organization, as we are representatives of said organization once we go on to social media. This really isn't about lore. What I'm trying to do is give you guys a perspective of who he is as a person, where I think he's at life, and why this response came out of him. When everybody's kind of blowing up about this, they're just going, oh, Blizzard hates all of us, and I don't think that's the case. But I haven't heard a lot of people, or really anybody, talk about this from the casual end of the player's spectrum, which is actually who I think their Azerite system hurts worst. Not the hardcore people, ironically. I think the Azerite system was ultimately built to make things like simming and min-maxing more interesting. Problem with that is you kind of need to add abilities and traits that change the way that you play the game and cause you to think about what you are doing with your character. And none of the current traits do that. They're basically plug and play. You're not choosing different talents, you're not choosing different styles of play. You're basically playing the same way you were before, so it really adds nothing that you didn't have before. When you're not adding something new and engaging, you're effectively adding a redundant system. But I think most of the hardcore concerns have been kind of addressed in the other videos, and I kind of want to hit on a few points that have not been addressed that I think are really important, especially for the casual players. Now, I believe that current modern World of Warcraft has become very user-unfriendly. There is a massive learning curve to anybody who's never picked up the game to try to learn it from scratch. Blizzard's old motto used to be easy to learn, difficult to master, and the new mantra kind of feels more like difficult to learn, impossible to master. Now, that's just how it feels. That's a perception. That's not like an objective fact, because I don't think you can objectively say that it is or isn't. That's my subjective interpretation. But if it feels that way to somebody that's been playing for 13 years, then there's probably some degree of truth to it. And I think a lot of the systems in classic World of Warcraft were so intuitive to players because they molded around classic RPG systems, and people had already played games like Morrowind, Skyrim, any of those kind of really popular RPGs were kind of baked into the system. Like, you'd go learn your class trainer spell from a class trainer, and you have to rank it up, and if you want to do crafting, you have to gather here and here, and things kind of made sense. You kind of started learning what statistics on your character meant and why you were wearing mail versus plate and all that kind of thing. Today, we have systems layered on top of systems on top of systems on top of systems. We have so many systems that it's actually stifling the game. It's like having a nice cake and having, a good amount of frosting on it. It's just right. It's in that Goldilocks zone, like, porridge. And then so let's add some more frosting to the top and some more frosting to the top and more frosting to the top. At what point does it cease to become a cake and it becomes a frosting? And that's kind of where, it's everything is icing. It's all frosting on the cake. There's only a little bit of cake left. And that's kind of where I think the systemic issue is coming from here. Ultimately, Azerite and Azerite traits are not needed to enjoy the game. If you were to extract the necklace in the whole Azerite thing and extract the Azerite traits, people would go on with playing the game as though nothing had happened. They wouldn't play or approach the game any differently. Azerite is a system as defined by Blizzard that they don't want you to go out and grind it. It's just something you kind of gain and gather as you play. So it's not really something that you can work towards or have some kind of sense of accomplishment in gaining. That is effectively an anti-RPG system, which is kind of confounding to me. I'm not entirely sure how they sat down in the boardroom one day and went, you know what, this is the system we're going to move forward with for Battle for Azeroth. We don't want people to have to farm it, but it's going to exist there, and it's not going to be impactful, but we're going to add it anyway. I'm not sure how that made it out of the meeting room without saying, well, why are we adding it then? And then they said, oh, well, we're going to bake Azerite traits into the game to make it more engaging. Almost you'd almost expect there to be some kind of follow-up question of, okay, so what kind of traits are we going to add then that's going to make it engaging? Oh, well, we're going to add traits that just kind of do like flat damage, or they add armor. You know, I'm not entirely sure how that conceptually got past that stage of development. As an outsider looking in, I'm just a little bit flummoxed by it. And truthfully, I think this expansion was a bit more rushed. And really, when Battle for Azeroth launched, I felt like it could have probably used another 3 months in the oven. Feels like it was probably about 6 or 8 months early. And that's not really a fault of the developers. That's just sometimes things in development just don't go the way you hope it would. Or certain things just don't pan out, and then you're scrambling to make a new system. Players might not realize this, but their complaints, and their avid complaints about how the legendary system worked and legendaries, as well as artifact weapons in Legion, could have directly affected why we have the Azerite system we have now, because we might have had something much closer to what the legendary system was and a tuning on it. And due to the incredible amounts of negative feedback it received in Legion, that they pulled back on it a long ways into development for Battle for Azeroth, and now we're feeling the effects of our own complaining. And I think that's something the player base doesn't really think about or recognize when they are making those kinds of complaints, because it sometimes it does directly affect the developers' thought processes too. So it's kind of hard to say. But kind of getting back to my original point of this being too much for new players to learn, and it being too difficult if you're a casual player to get into, put yourself in the shoes of somebody who can only play a few hours a week. Or you come into the game to enjoy the story, the lore, the role play, you want to wander the world, see the stories, experience a lot of the fun stuff. You're probably only going to be around for the first month, and you'll unsub till the next patch comes out, because that's a majority of the player base, whether people like that or not. That's not going to change. It's always been that way in World of Warcraft. It's always been that way in every MMO I've ever played, actually. And these people that are casual usually have very active lives outside of the video game, and they're usually are people that aren't content creators, and so their voice isn't really being heard, because they're not usually the people that go to the forums and complain about systems not working for them. What they would do is, if they just don't like something in the game, they are just going to unsub from the game, or they're going to stop playing it, and they're not going to go to the forums and cry and moan. The thing that the hardcore players don't realize is that we need these people as a community. These are our future community members, people making YouTube videos, people becoming hardcore. I mean, I was back around the time where I was, an old veteran of the game when we were calling people Wrath babies, right? Making fun of people that started during Wrath of the Lich King, Cataclysm came out, the dungeons were hard, they were complaining about how difficult they were, and ha ha ha, they're Wrath babies. I mean, look at the number of people that quit the game due to that. There has to be a balance, just like all things in life. And that's not to rip on Cataclysm, because this is a very unpopular opinion, but Cataclysm was my favorite expansion for those that haven't watched some of my previous videos. What I'm trying to say is that there is a ton of entry barriers to this game right now. It's very hard to start as a new player and want to continue to even reach the end game. Most of these players aren't even reaching to the point of the Azerite system in Battle for Azeroth. They're just not getting there. Why? The whole leveling experience just isn't that engaging. Crafting and the professions are just kind of really weak. They're not fulfilling. The open world out there when they're questing is largely empty. I mean, you see little boosts during allied race releases, but those are mostly players who are already playing the game, have been playing for years, right? These aren't new people that are going out there. Obviously, they have to unlock the allied races, but at least it populates the world so it doesn't feel like they're running around alone. And that's been kind of one of my chief complaints, and one of my big hopes for the world quest system is, let's put these daily quests, these world quests, and we can send people back into the old world, especially in Battle for Azeroth, where, maybe let's go assault a Horde base, or let's go to Camp Tarajo as the Alliance, and maybe assault the Gates of Mulgore, and there might be a bunch of level 120s out there fighting each other or doing quests, and some level 15 runs by and goes, oh, that's really cool. They don't see that. There's nothing like that for them. But there used to be in this game. And that's part of the reason that other people like Nixium or Asmongold, people that fell in love with the game, if we were to start now, we would probably all unsub. I mean, truth of the matter is, people that love World of Warcraft right now, the people that are content creators, probably if you were to stick them into the game today and say, start playing this, tell me what you think of it, I highly, highly doubt they would reach 120. And if they did, I don't think they would stay subbed for long, even if they did. Just the truth of the matter is. And that's part of what made Wrath of the Lich King so successful to so many people, is because of how accessible it was. Because I know a lot of people like to think of Wrath of the Lich King as, oh, this was the golden era of WoW, but people forget, people like me who cleared Nax 40, like, Nax Ramus in Wrath of the Lich King for people like me were like, really? You're going to rehash an entire raid tier? Okay, well, I'm just going to level up and take a break until the next raid tier comes out. Looking for group? Completely rifted the community forever. But the systems in there, and the things that, there was so much lore, so much story. It was so immersive in so many ways. You had a lot of contact with the Lich King. Professions were meaningful, not as meaningful as they were in Burning Crusade, because professions in World of Warcraft truthfully have never been that great compared to other MMOs. It's one of those sticking points that I have with World of Warcraft and always have. I mean, I don't know why would Blizzard ever go away from having a blacksmith and you got to choose whether you wanted to be an armor smith or a weaponsmith. And if you became a weaponsmith, you could make this axe, this mace, or this sword, but you could only pick one of those, and you got locked out of the other ones. That was really cool. Like, why remove that kind of thing? But I digress from kind of my original point here. Of the Azerite system just isn't engaging for new players. Like, even if they kind of might like the cool idea of it, there's not really anything that affects their gameplay that makes them feel cool. There's not that, oh wow moment, I'm really overpowered now, or this, wow, I have this different spell effect, or oh wow, I unlock this different ability, or oh wow, maybe I'll choose cool different new talent choices, or it'll change my gameplay in some way to be more fulfilling. There's nothing like that in there. And when you kind of look at the response that lore has on the forums here, you kind of realize that although I genuinely believe this is a lot of what lore's saying, there's a degree of Blizzard in this as well, and I think there's still a degree of denial about the fact that this system is fundamentally flawed. That's because you're adding something in that doesn't need to be there. Too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. Adding complexity for the sake of complexity is bad. And I know a lot of the community has been saying, oh, give us more talents and give us more talent trees, give us more ability to customize our characters and all those things. So I think Blizzard's kind of hearing what the community is saying, but they're misinterpreting what the community means. People don't want complexity for the sake of complexity. They want meaning fulfillment behind the choices that they make. They want some degree of engagement. They don't want a Fallout 4 type system where basically, you have 4 choices, but they all result in the same exact action. It doesn't change your gameplay, For one option, it was like Sean, or Sean. If you played Fallout 4, it's like, okay, well, that's really only one option being disguised as 4 options. And that's kind of the crux of what the Azerite system is. But I think the truth of the matter is, everyone, this is just something we're going to have to deal with for Battle for Azeroth, and whether you like it or dislike it, it's here to stay for now anyway. There are some simple fixes, and the one I would suggest would just to be why when we have these Azerite traits, I recognize that they're probably still not going to be engaging, but let's make it accessible and not burdensome to people so that it feels like they have to carry around 1 billion pieces of gear, or that they have to go back and have it reforged. Because, as Blizzard admitted before, the reason they didn't add the reforging system that they used to have in Cataclysm back is because it feels bad to have to leave a raid or a group dungeon and go back and reforge your trait and then get summoned back. Well, that's exactly what's happening with Azerite Reforger, so I mean, what you do is you just unlock it. When you're not in combat, it's kind of like a talent tree. Maybe you have to be in a rested zone to change your trait on your piece of gear, but if you do that and you allow people to just kind of swap it on the fly in between boss encounters, that doesn't fix kind of the fundamental flaws of the system. I honestly don't think there's going to be anything that will, but that makes it more palatable to players, and it's going to make it to where people aren't revolting at the higher end of the game. Obviously, this doesn't impact casuals nearly as much. The way that you impact casuals is to make it more visible to see what your Azerite level on your neck piece actually gives you. And that can be through story content or lines of dialogue with Magni or some kind of system where it feels like, oh, me leveling this up is like dinging in World of Warcraft and going from 110 to 111. Hooray! Which, I mean, even that's been diminished because you used to get a talent point, right? And nowadays you don't really get anything except the mobs next to you scale, which feels not very great. Probably the topic of another video, but I think the core crux of this whole fundamental flaw of this system is it's not an RPG system in an RPG game, and I think a lot of the complaints that people have towards World of Warcraft, if any World of Warcraft devs or community managers are listening, is that you keep building systems and forcing people into paths, which means you're effectively taking away their ability to roleplay in a role-playing game. Stop trying to funnel us. The game is more enjoyable when we get to decide our own paths. Not everybody wants to do Mythic Plus. Not everybody wants to raid. Create end games for everyone, that whether that be, crafting professions, gathering professions, gold selling, pet battles, questing. Like, people can have their own unique rewards and progression systems within all of those things. If I'm a crafter, I shouldn't have to run dungeons to get a hydrocore. That's just silly. Make it bind on equip so people that do like running dungeons can sell them in the auction house, make a profit, but people that like to work on professions and can craft can also obtain the item. I mean, that's the whole basis of kind of the system. I mean, granted, some of the gear that you craft is going to have to be way more valuable than it is right now, which I think a lot of the problems with the legendary system in Legion could have simply been fixed by tying all of the legendaries into crafting professions. Honestly, I really do. If people could have just focused on that, made it accessible, and they could sell them on the auction house or trade them to players, I think a lot of the issues people had with the legendary system in Legion goes out the window. I mean, that doesn't factor in part of the balance component of it, but I mean, honestly, the balance component can be pretty easy, and that can be tweaked. But that makes professions more engaging. That makes it so legendaries are accessible to all players, like top-end raiders. If top-end raiders, they're just not going to have the time to do something that would be as intricate as crafting a legendary, right? Or becoming a master crafter. That's like too much of a time sink for them. It's better for them just to have a master crafter on the server make that item from you and then buy it, which creates an economy of sorts within the game, or a role-playing game, to where I can have a role, right? So right now there's a bunch of people in the game that are role players without roles. If you're not a Mythic Plus or a Raider, you are without a role right now in the game. And that's kind of the fundamental flaw, and this is where it's hurting the casuals worse. And this Azerite system being built around Raiders and Mythic Plus people is why it's not fun for casuals. Like, I'm not entirely sure how else to put it. Like, if you're out there questing and you're unlocking these traits and you're getting these trait gear, like, and you're clicking a button to lock it in, what does that do for you? Nothing. There's no sense of fulfillment. So they need to add something in there. Like, this would be my more complex suggestion, because I think professions have always been my soapbox that I like to stand on when it comes to this stuff, is tie the Azerite system and those things that you slot in, these Azerite traits, tie that to professions, right? It's kind of like the old glyph system, where glyphs used to work only for inscriptionists, and you could pop in a glyph and it would do this, or change your class this way. Well, you can do that with all of the professions. Like, maybe a blacksmith can make this trait, maybe an inscriptionist can make this trait. Maybe like for like an enchanter, they already have enchanting on the side. But honestly, I think each crafting profession probably should have its own trait. It gives a value to it. You can create some degree of complexity with it. It would effectively be Glyphs 2.0, but it would be better than Glyphs because it's just not locked to one profession and it has value. And the other end of that is you're going to probably have to, you can't just put in some of these traits that they have right now, which just randomly proc some extra damage or randomly just give you extra armor. There has to be maybe some on-use traits. I mean, basically kind of effects that were on our Legion artifact weapons and some of the legendaries. That's engaging. It's far more intuitive to see stats and procs and on-use abilities on the actual item, rather than having to shift right-click on an item, look at all the abilities on the piece of gear, select which one is better for you, or which one you think might be best for you, and then just click on it. That's super, super unintuitive to people that are even veterans of the game. I mean, that's why there's so much simming that's going on. Imagine being a casual coming in. It's just like, I have no freaking idea what's best for me. The RPG needs to be reintroduced into the MMO RPG. Instead of funneling everybody into one or two paths, have no paths. Let people explore on their own. Create an endgame for everyone. I invest a ton of time into battle pets. I would expect that somebody that hardcore raids shouldn't be able to catch up to me, or I have something unique from them. Or, whatever other endgame we're talking about. Whether that be gold making, or even questing. And those rewards should be somewhat comparable to Mythic Plus and raiding. Maybe not with gear, but with prestige, visual effects, unique transmogs. There's tons of things that Blizzard could do. Unique titles, basically kind of what they do for PvP, which is kind of a side system of World of Warcraft, if we're to be honest. So here is the too long didn't listen version of this podcast for those that don't have the attention span of 30, 40 minutes. I don't know how long I've been rambling. Most of the large World of Warcraft community members have been kind of focusing on more of the hardcore aspects, how it affects the top-end players. I actually think it affects the casual players the most because it's unengaging and it's adding a incredible layer of complexity to an already complex game. It's not directly intuitive, rewarding, or visibly impactful to those people. The system is ultimately, in my view, fundamentally flawed. The things that Lore, aka Josh Allen, said is not out of character for Josh Allen. I think what we might be seeing is a little bit of burnout from him. And if what comes across in his text format is just his personality, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's reflective of Blizzard. But what is disconcerting is that a community manager who's supposed to be kind of the mouthpiece from the community to the developers probably isn't as engaged with the game as they once used to be, which makes it hard for them to translate our wants, needs, and desires to the devs. There was no need for Lore to point out that the title thread was hyperbolic. Comparing something that was farmable, that only affected a very select portion of the community, is not comparable to a system that affects everyone. The fact that they think that the imbalance between the traits is the real problem here shows a level of disconnect with their system, or what might be more concerning is the fact that they just don't even recognize it. And if you don't recognize a problem, you can't address said problem, which means that we could effectively be in a worse spot by the end of Battle for Azeroth than we were in Warlords of Draenor if they don't come to some kind of realization with this and accept it. Complexity does not equal interesting. Blizzard should be looking for ways to discourage simming, not encourage simming. The idea of having us carry around multiple sets for a single spec is incredibly overwhelming, especially to casuals. There is no amount of balance tuning that can fix a core fundamental problem, just like a band-aid isn't going to take the place of stitches. Haha, nursing reference. The very fact that you need a reforger for this system is somewhat admitting the flaw to the system indirectly. Basically everything that Lore said here I see as a cause of concern for the community. Although we might fundamentally disagree with Lore and the Blizzard development team on these issues, at least they are communicating with us, and we need them to keep communicating with us. And by insulting and being inflammatory towards them, saying all these negative things about them, does nothing to help us ultimately. Remember, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. If you're feeling really negative about this post, try to ignore what Lore says and look at what Chaos Bug says, and try to emulate the way that Chaos Bug communicated with the development team. It is the blueprint of how to approach them in the right way. If enough of us approach them the way Chaos Bug did, we will see results. If you like this episode of The Flight Path, I encourage you to look at some of my other videos. Follow, like, comment, subscribe, click the bell. Always remain gracious and respectful. My name has been Kind Death. All of you have a good day.